Hör ni mig bättre nu? Okay. We'll do this lecture in English as well, for the respect of our online viewers and those of you who better understand English. Today's lecture, this is a series of lectures about the smart city, and today we'll talk about privacy. Perhaps not the most enthusiastic subject, unfortunately, but perhaps for me, as an example, it's the most important. Privacy is a very underrated issue. Many people cannot even define it. Do you know what privacy means? Would some of you be confident to provide the definition? And unfortunately, very few people can. But let's start with a recapture from last week's lecture, quite quickly. We talked about all different kinds of smart things, and we concluded that smart is not necessarily intelligent. So smart means connected, automated. It might be smart for someone, but not necessarily for you. And so what we want to focus on in these lectures is how do we create a smart society that is smart for us citizens who are supposed to live in these societies. As you know, there are some smart city projects that are worse than others. And so it might be good to know what could happen to us unless we take care to avoid this. And I like to mention the Smart City project of China, or Smart Society project of China, the social credit system, that aims at evaluating the value, more or less, of each citizen. How honest they are, how credible they are, how well they can be trusted, and so on and so forth. And obviously, they get all this information from anything you do on internet, all your searches, what you buy, where you buy it, what friends you have, your health, and all these things. And it affects more or less anything you do in your life. Access to schools, access to jobs, visas for traveling abroad. Welcome. Access to loans, anything. So if you are a dissident, the society doesn't like you, you can forget your career, your children will be punished, you cannot travel, you cannot express yourself. The only thing you can do well is go down and die, more or less. So we have to ask ourselves, is that smart for us? Technically, this is a very interesting technical platform, obviously, but it's not a good platform for us as citizens. And so I like to repeat this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 12, which too few people know about. And the origin of privacy can be found in this basic human right, which states as follows: no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, his family, home or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. And obviously in today's society, even in the West, we must recognize that this is no longer modern. Very few respect this, and people who get their honor and reputation attacked don't get any protection from the law. But this statement was formulated after the Second World War. Hopefully, we don't have to reissue a new statement after a new crisis. Perhaps we can learn from this. And this is also the point of these lectures, to bring back this into our collective memory and work with this. And so we discussed as a final conclusion, say, of last week's or last lecture, a vision of what a smart city or smart society is or could be. And we'll focus on primarily the privacy part today, but this vision is as follows. So in the society we will have ubiquitous access to interoperable sensors and things. And ubiquitous here means they are everywhere. So wherever there can be some kind of device, there will be one. And they will be interoperable. You will be able to access and communicate with them. There will also be ubiquitous access to data and information from society's authorities. So authorities of the government, they belong to us citizens, so we have the right to have access to their data. Not necessarily for free, but at least have access. There will also be smart services in all niches of society. So where there is a need, there will be a possibility for a smart service that automates that part of society. We will have a definition of ownership of information. We'll have protection of this ownership, so we can own information. Today we don't have this protection. Also, there will be a protection of privacy by design and default, and we'll talk about what this means today. And there will also be a market, an open economic market for these services, things, and information, because this is needed to get all this to work, and that's the subject of another lecture. So let's focus on privacy. You saw the declaration. The declaration is written in an old language. It's not really applicable to modern conditions. So we have to try to redefine privacy somehow. But what does it fundamentally mean? The idea here was to avoid creating a society where the authorities know through surveillance what you're doing and use this information to blackmail you into compliance. So the privacy human right basically means that you, as a person, as a citizen, have the right to have a confidential conversation. You cannot do as Google said, if you don't have anything to hide, why worry? So you have the right to have your private life. You have the right to choose with whom you speak. You have the right to speak confidential things, private things. And you have the right to protection from the law against any unwarranted monitoring or searches. You have the right to choose. Now, if we extend this now to our online presence, so if we don't include computers here, this is not so controversial. But if we include computer systems, take the social networks, do we still have the right to choose with whom we speak? So proponents of today's biggest social networks say that our service is for free, you choose to use it. And so we can use more or less the data as we choose. Now, those proponents of privacy would say that's an infringement of privacy, because you cannot choose to have an online conversation in a social network. And the problem is obviously the information that you provide digitally is very easy to analyze, very easy to draw conclusions about what you think and what you like, who you know, and you also obviously write about secret ideas you have, intellectual property, if you're working with these things. So others can use these ideas and steal them from you. Now, social networks is one thing. We have a discussion at least about this in media today. So many people should be aware that there is a problem with the large social network platforms. However, what about privacy for Internet of Things? If you choose to buy a sensor or a wristwatch or other wearable device or a smart car or whatever you choose to buy, that thing will start to communicate with other things or other systems, perhaps without you knowing. Do you have the right to choose whom is going to have access to this data or not? Is it your choice, or is it the choice of the manufacturer? Who should be able to decide? Proponents of privacy obviously say that you as the owner should be able to choose. The manufacturer, they claim that they have the right to choose. Now the problem is, most people don't realize what you can learn from data from sensors. So as we talked about a little bit last lecture, from a water meter you can know not only when somebody's home, but perhaps if they're taking a shower or cooking, or perhaps how many people there are in the house, and so on and so forth. A wearable device obviously monitors your health, can be very sensitive. You don't know others. You don't want others to learn your health status. Even less manipulate it, blackmail you. If you have a pacemaker, they can turn it off perhaps. How much could they blackmail you for? So for all these reasons, I'd like to cite James Clapper, who was an national director of national intelligence in the United States. He said in a report only 2.5 years ago that America's greatest threat is the Internet of Things. It's not terrorism, it's not nuclear war, it's not biological warfare, it's the Internet of Things. So if he thinks that is the greatest threat, it's because he knows how many bad solutions there are and what others can do with him. Now, if they can access all these systems, they can also access all the data, which tells a lot about you. So this is not only a military threat or security threat, it's a very big privacy threat. So, there are some good news. Some good news, at least. You might have heard of the General Data Protection Regulation. So it's actually one regulation that is actually trying to help ordinary citizens when it comes to privacy. It doesn't go all the way, but it's a very good start, and if we look at the world today, perhaps the best privacy legislation available. So the goal of the General Data Protection Regulation is not only to harmonize and balance regulation in Europe, but also to provide a real protection for privacy for citizens. And there is this very strange sentence on the first page, more or less. It says, the goal is also to facilitate the free flow of information. So this sounds insidious if you're a cynic. And the goal, obviously, here is to let companies freely share personal information between each other. Today, legally, or before the General Data Protection Regulation, legally, much of what we did was illegal. But the rules and regulations that were applicable before didn't have any means to enforce the policies. So what the General Data Protection Regulation does is it regulates how we process personal data very, very strictly. And as long as you follow these rules, you are allowed to share this with others. I'll talk more about what these rules are. So it's not a free flow as you can share it with anyone. What it means is that you don't have to apply for a permit every time you share information with another company or entity. So the General Data Protection Regulations puts limits on what you can do, what you are allowed to do with personal data, and it includes it cannot go into technical details, because then obviously the law would become obsolete very quickly. So it tries to find the minimum and the maximum level that you have to adhere to without mentioning technical details. And it does this by mentioning state of the art. So state of the art, those of you who have worked with patents know that professionals in the field or skilled in the art, as it's mentioned, they know what the state of the art is. So a person who is skilled in data protection knows what the state of the art for a specific question is. And so by saying this, it makes lack of knowledge, it's not an acceptable argument, because what GDPR also states is that you don't have to do more than what is in proportion to the rights and freedoms of the subjects about whose data you process. So it makes clear that this proportionality is not the amount of effort you have to do, it's the amount of effort a person who is skilled in the art has to do. Does that make sense? So if you don't know how to do it, that's not a reasonable defense. You have to either know what you're doing or hire somebody to do it or stop processing. Otherwise, there will be this to pay, a lot of them. So we have to know then what is personal information. So if the law is very severe when it comes to processing of personal data, we need to know what personal data or personal information is, as well as what processing is. So personal information, personal data is any information relating either directly or indirectly to an identified or identifiable natural person. So this is a very, very broad definition. So it doesn't matter if we know who the person is or not. If somebody else is able to identify the natural person from the data, then it's personal. It doesn't have to be a direct relation either. It can be an indirect, and it doesn't stipulate how many levels of indirection. So this definition is obviously very broad. I would state that it's much easier to just say that all the data that in some way or another relates to a person everything is personal. It's more easy than to try to figure out what parts of the data is personal and what is not. Processing is also very broadly defined. Basically, it says any operation or set of operation which is performed on personal data or sets of personal data. It doesn't mention automatic here anywhere, so also manual processes are included. So very, very broad definitions. So they have a special article about profiling also, yeah. So we'll talk more about profiling. Now, so a natural reaction for people who are confronted with the general data protection regulation is that, okay, then let's anonymize so we don't have to worry. Now, people are using anonymization very, very sloppily. They believe actually that a lot of things they do is anonymization when it's not. So the definition of anonymization is it's no longer possible to identify a data subject, as these natural persons are called. No longer possible. That's a mathematical proof. Yes? Yes. Then it's not anonymous. So well, illegal it can be. So the question was, if I keep the identities or the information on a separate database externally, and I anonymize it in one dataset but keep the information. Now, this is called pseudonymization in GDPR. So the definition of pseudonymization is that data subjects can be identified with the use of data that is kept separately. So this is the answer to your question. So if you extract some data, you replace it with a hash number or ordinal number or something, it is not anonymized. GDPR still applies. Pseudonymization is recognized as a data protection mechanism. So it's a data protection mechanism, but it doesn't make the data anonymized. Now, there are some methods to anonymize data. For instance, data obfuscation, where you destroy parts of the data. For instance, if you destroy 1 byte of the IP address, 4 bytes, then the remaining 3 bytes have sufficient information to perhaps say something about the region, but not an online identity which would be able to be related to you as a user. Statistical aggregation, if you do sums or variances, standard deviations, or other statistical operations on populations, then those results would be anonymized as long as the population is sufficiently big, whatever that means. It doesn't state. But if you just replace an identity with a pseudonym, an invented name, a hash, or an ordinal number, it's pseudonymized. GDPR still applies. No. So as long as this data is available anywhere else. So for instance, hash, I marked hash here in bold because people use a hash as a magic tool to say they create something that is not reversible, and that's not true. So for instance, say you have a system that computes a hash about your identity, which consists of your name, your telephone number, your personal number, perhaps a salt value. Okay, and then you create a hash, a digest, which you store in your system, and then you throw away your identity. And you say, okay, I cannot identify you. I cannot identify you. But that's not how personal data is defined. Personal data is defined as if it is possible. So my competitor can say, I have all this interesting information with the hashes. I know that the hashes are based on names and telephone numbers, personal numbers, and a salt. And I happen to have the salt value here because I paid $5,000 to someone to extract it. Now, I also have the telephone book here. Some might remember those. And I compute all the hashes available to all people. And you find, oh, here's a hash that matches your data record. So I identified you. The hash value is not an anonymization of your identity. So then, what is allowed? A lot of people talk about what's not allowed, so we have to know what is allowed. And I include this famous painting. Anyone knows what it's called? So this painting is a minimalist painting, and that's actually a good definition of what you can do in GDPR. As little as possible, for as short a time as possible, with as few purposes as possible. You can share it with as few people or entities as possible. You have to do it as correctly as possible. Only if there are no other means to do what you're attempting to do. And also you have to provide the subjects with transparent information. So this is what the GDPR states. You cannot do any superfluous processing. As little as you can imagine. Now, what you do has also to be protected with proportional data protection mechanisms, as I said. Now, data protection is a very important part of the GDPR, and it doesn't really state explicitly how to go about it, because obviously it's professional. It changes from day to day almost. But there are some things that it states that are very important. For instance, that it has to be protected by design and by default. it mentions state of the art. Now, by design and by default is a very interesting concept. So by design means you cannot add a security as a varnish. It has to permeate the entire solution, the entire architecture. You cannot add a web page with a login that goes to an unsecure database. That's not by design. It might look like a secure system to the untrained eye, but it's not. And so GDPR does not allow for such data protection. It has to be by design. It also has to be by default. Now, default means that security is not added afterwards. It's intrinsic. It's from the start. You do not add security on top of a feature. You carve out unsecurity by giving permissions. So, for instance, if you take an operating system 10 or 20 years ago and you install it on a computer, it would have a blank password. It wouldn't have a password even, perhaps. That's not by default. So installing an operating system should require a secure password, or this system is not installed, for instance. Example here is the blacklist and the whitelist. So for memory reasons, older systems, they used blacklists. Everything was permitted except what's on the list. That's not by default. Whitelist, on the other hand, nothing is permitted except what's on the list. So that's by default. If you have an empty list, then nothing is permitted. You also have to give transparent information. Now, transparent information is very difficult to understand because it's a relatively new concept for us as engineers. We typically we didn't work with this as a natural part. So we have to learn what does it mean to provide transparent information. Transparent is not the same as being open. So being open means you can have 1 million documents and say, here, read. I hide nothing. Code is open source. I have 2 million lines of code here. Go look. That's not being transparent. So transparency means what you have to say or write that is relevant to the receiver. It has to be simple to understand, easily accessed, clear and plain language. It can be measured by how it's received, how it's understood. A legal document is not transparent. A legal document you can measure semantically what the words actually state. And it's what the words actually state that is important. In a transparent text, it's what you understand after having read the text. If you don't understand, if you have 100 people and they don't understand what the text says, then the text is to blame. It's not transparent. I liken this with an aquarium. So anyone who's gone to an aquarium and often stood there looking, where is the spider or where is the lizard? So transparency means that the aquarium has to be the right size for what you're actually trying to find. If you don't find it, the size can be wrong, it can be too big, or it can be dirty, it's not clear. So you have to have both the openness and the correct amount of size. The size matters. Your processing activity needs to be based on a legal foundation. And the GDPR provides you with 6 options. You have to select one. If you cannot select one, what you do is illegal, more or less. Some of you might have heard about consent. So this typically applies to if you have an online application, you have to consent, I agree, or you download a mobile phone app, you agree, and so on. Consent is a very simple form of accepting whatever you're accepting. There are 2 requirements here. The information that you receive has to be transparent. If it's not legal. Secondly, it should be as easy to withdraw your consent as to give it. So normally companies are very good at allowing you to accept the agreement, but how do you withdraw the agreement, the consent? Another legal basis might be legal obligation. There are laws requiring certain types of processing, so you're allowed to do it according to that law. You might have a legitimate interest. Now, legitimate interest means that, for instance, a company who finds an economic interest, for instance, to do a certain type of processing is allowed to do so if the value to the company or the interest to the company is greater than the risks to the data subjects. So this is very difficult, obviously. The GDPR doesn't state how this is to be valued. So you might have an objective value, company profits or revenue, against a very subjective feeling about rights. But it's what the GDPR states. Remember that obviously the processing has to be minimalistic and it has to be transparent. So you cannot do anything secretively. You can do processing based on a contract. If the subjects have signed the contract, you can do whatever the contract stipulates for that amount of time. You can do something in with a vital interest. If you have a vital interest, vital here, vita means life. Anything that can save a life, you're allowed to do under, as long as you protect the data accordingly. And public interest is more broad. So if, for example, we can find a way to reduce the pollution, for instance, but it would require someone to do a certain type of processing that would invade our privacy, we could estimate is the interest of the public greater than the interest of the corresponding subjects. Then you can do this. Obviously, these things will be evaluated in courts. No one knows today where the limits are. You have to use common sense. Now, this is why the law is a good law for us as individuals, because it provides us, people, the data subjects, a great range of rights that are actually formulated and stipulated. So we have the rights to get transparent information about any processing about our personal information. There are some exceptions, like government agencies or that have the right to do, for instance, intelligence work. But other than that, we have the right to get information about whatever processes our personal information. We also have the right to get access to this information. So if we know that information is being processed, we can also go there and require access so we can see whatever is being processed. We can also ask for our data back, at least if it's the data we have provided. So we have to get it in a portable format that we can give to somebody else. So this is the first attempt to define ownership of information actually in a law. So if you have provided information, you have the right to get that information back. And you have the right to give it to a competitor to that company. So the company cannot claim the information is theirs. But it is only restricted to data that you have provided yourselves. And whatever that means is not defined. So does it include, it includes me writing, it includes me talking, it includes me talking to a third party that writes it down. It includes things that I record. But does it include, for instance, if I have a sensor on? Do I provide this information, it measures what I do? A microphone counts, but other types of sensors, if I have a wristwatch, for instance, or if I drive a car, does that mean that I provide the information because I'm steering? I don't know. We have the right to correct any data we find erroneous. No one can avoid correcting erroneous information. We also have the right to a certain extent to erase our personal information. It depends on what legal grounds the process is being based on. So if the legal grounds is consent, we have an absolute right. If the legal base is based on a legal law, then we have no right, because the law weighs higher. If the processing is based on a legitimate interest, then we have the right to get our data erased unless the company or authority has a compelling reason to keep it. And compelling here means they are not, they cannot continue their service or their operation without this data. All other data they have to delete. We can object. So if we call a company and say, hey, I want my data deleted, they say, I don't know how to do that. You can obviously object, and you can require them to restrict processing. This means that they're not allowed to continue. They can keep the data while they're debating what to do, but they're not allowed to use it anyway. At least until they've figured out what they're allowed to or not. And you mentioned automatic profiling. You have the right to avoid being the subject of automatic decisions that have a negative consequence in some legal sense for you, that is based on automatic profiling. And profiling here means that you have these systems that try to analyze who you are, what you do, and why, and how valuable are you. Or you are not allowed to create processes that create automatic decisions based on such processes. You have to include at least a human being. Humans are still allowed to do mistakes, in the sense that if a human does a mistake, you at least know who to go to court with. That person has to answer for their actions in a court of law. But an algorithm, who is responsible for an algorithm? So how can we know an algorithm is just or does the right thing? How can you assure that this profiling method is just? And we cannot go to court with a poor programmer who was forced to write this code. So it's simply not allowed. What's more, all these rights that you have, the company, the entity, the controller, as they are called, they are obligated to propagate these rights to anyone they share the data with. So if you correct the data with a controller or company who you know has this information, and where you found this, they have to propagate this correction to anyone with whom they have shared this information. Also, if you delete the data, so if you don't want the data there anymore, they are forced to make sure that anyone with whom they have shared the data also delete the data. And this includes, as they say, links, copies, and reproductions. This includes, obviously, then backups. Now, how to solve that is an open question, but it's what it states. So basically, if you don't want to be in their database, they have to delete you from the database and also from all backups. And obviously, if that's not possible, they have to at least make sure that if they restore a backup, those sections are not restored. So the first right you have is to get transparent information about all processes of your data. If they don't inform you, you have the right to damages. And this applies to all companies in the world that processes information about European citizens. It also applies to all citizens of the world if the controller is European. Did that answer your question? Yeah. So, why do we talk about this? We have had privacy legislation for decades. No one has cared before, so why now? They have cared a bit more. You're correct. So there are some countries where they have cared a little. Now they care a lot. And the reason is the sanctions. So one of the reasons to create this regulation was to provide or to give authorities sufficient power to change the actions of even the world's greatest companies. There should be no company in the world who can avoid looking into these issues just because they can shift countries or pay small fines. So the amount of sanctions that you can get is so big that all companies in the world who aim at the European market have to consider all these things. Now, what are the authorities allowed to do? What can they do to you? So first of all, they are allowed access to all your sites, your equipment, your information, anything they like. They can claim access to audit it. Then obviously they can begin by providing warnings, say this is not a good idea, so try to think about it. Then they can give you reprimands, they can give you, sorry, okay, question. They can get access to all information. Yes. Yes. And here I refer here to the information about the process. So all you cannot say that it's a trade secret or a company secret how your processing works. Yes. Yes. You're correct. So the question is it the protection of privacy to give authorities access to sensitive information? And so this is actually somewhat of an open question. There are things in the law, one of which you mentioned. There are others. For instance, in Sweden we have this right to get access to all information that are given to authorities. And similar laws exist in other countries. Now, if you have a breach, you're forced to provide information to the authority about this breach. So this insecurity becomes public. And so obviously the Data Protection Authority here in Sweden wrote a letter to the government saying, perhaps this is not such a good idea. And there are some things here, it's not a perfect law, and I agree with you that access to all information might not be a good idea, but it is what they have, if they want. So there is no way for a company to hide information by claiming it's a trade secret. So if they want to know how data is being protected and what the sensitivity of the data is, they are able to do so. You can, of course, deny them access, but then we'll get further down the list. What happens then? Yes. So yes, so there are requirements on how to inform subjects when breaches happen, and in what circumstances you have to inform them, and in what you cannot. So yes, yes, correct. but it's perhaps we should use this microphone in case. In case. But we can summarize it as follows. No. So it's true what you say. It has risks, and so it's not a perfect in the sense that there will be no victims of this law. The point is, will there be less victims with or without the law? And so they decided this is the way to have less victims. But I agree, there are things that are problematic, and hopefully the European Commission will adjust this as we go, because it also states that the European Commission has this obligation to yearly accumulate experience from different countries and adapt the law accordingly. But I agree, it's a long process, and it's not without its risks. But anyway, it continues. Some argue, what is the strongest sanction they can actually use? Now, some would say that this right to shut down the entire process is the strongest. Some would say that it's the fine that's the strongest, which can be up to 4% of the global annual turnover, which is obviously huge. And it's calculated on the group of companies, not the individuals. So you cannot divide your company into one small company that does the processing and then save the overall group turnover. And some would say the damages are the worst, because you're also, not only can you get a fine, not only can they just shut down your entire process, they can also require you to pay damages. And damages include indirect damages, and there is a reverse burden of proof. You have to pay unless you can prove that you are innocent. So choose which one is worse from a company perspective, but they're very strong sanctions. We can all agree on that. So taking this into account, this new privacy legislation actually acts as a paradigm shift. It forces a paradigm shift on how we do information systems. So if you would have asked me 10 or 20 years ago, perhaps I would have said the more data you collect, the more potential value you might have. This is no longer true. Instead, the more you collect, the more risk you have, and the greater your responsibility. Because even if you collect all this data, even if you in the future find a new way to process this data to give you value, you're not allowed to use the historical data for this purpose. You're only allowed to use data that you collect after you inform the subjects about it. So there is no point in collecting a lot of data just because you can. You have to limit your greed for information to that to which you can assign a value, which is valuable, not only to you, but in general. So I'll skip this section a bit. We talked last lecture about ownership. Ownership of data is poorly defined. You saw an example in the GDPR. They tried to define a way to give you ownership, at least of the data you provide. But there are ways to protect ownership of data, and basically how you do that is not providing it to a third party. As long as you manage the information you yourself locally, you can also control access to the data. Now, if you can control access to the data, you can also protect your own privacy. Now this I'll skip a couple of slides here. This manner of processing information we call edge computing. Processing is done as close to the source of the information as possible instead of as centrally. And if you use edge computing in your architectures, that's a way to protect the information and protect the privacy of any data subjects. It has a further benefit. Limiting access to the information intrinsically gives that information a value, because you can control who gets access to it and also negotiate, obviously, the value of that information. If you give it away, the only one who has value of your information is the one you gave it to. Now, there are other technologies that help you or that might actually work against privacy. And the point of this lecture is also to give an overview of the different technologies that we use today in smart cities. We try to relate this to smart cities. So there are a lot of smart city and IoT solutions today. And many of them create needless problems. They actually create more privacy issues than the original processing would require. And you might know some of these technologies that I list here. These are all technologies that create more problems when it comes to privacy than they solve. They might solve other problems very neatly, but when it comes to privacy, they create a lot of problems. We discussed centralized processing, HTTP, most people know what that is. Constrained application protocol, which is a binary version. MQTT, people might have heard of. Blockchain, very popular buzzword. So if you hear about these technologies, know that they create problems. And so what does it mean? It means that it doesn't mean that it's impossible to create solutions that protect privacy. It just means that it's much more difficult. Sometimes it's impossible, but not necessarily so. Now, we've discussed centralized processing also a lot. So the more information you have on a single node in a network, the more value that node has. And finally, the value becomes so great, so it's actually reasonable to expect attacks on the node. The cost of breaking into a node has a certain cost, depending on the technology. But if you make the node sufficiently big, obviously, the interest becomes greater and the value-effort ratio increases. Now, if there is a breach, consequences are huge. You put all your eggs in the same basket, you can have these massive leaks that we have all heard about. They're all from centralized systems. Web technologies, HTTP is a great protocol. It's perhaps the most known and used protocol in development. Great for retrieving information in public systems or getting access to documents and links and all these things, as it was designed to do. It's a protocol that's very good at what it was designed to do. However, when it comes to Internet of Things, it is not so good. So it has very poor performance when it comes to security-related things, authentication, authorization, and a distributed architecture. This is why most HTTP solutions tend to be centralized, because that's how the protocol was defined. And to build smart city solutions, now the aliens come again. Can you hear? Which button? Can you hear? Can you hear me now? Anyway, as most people who work in security could attest, creating secure solutions based on the HTTP protocol is not a trivial task. So it can be done, but to believe your system is secure is very difficult, because it's used in ways it was not designed to be used. There is a binary version, a much more lightweight version of HTTP called the Constrained Application Protocol, and is very popular with things, Internet of Things. And it has a standardized middleware protocol called lightweight machine-to-machine, which defines a standardized ways to collect data. And so it actually solves a lot of things, but it also requires you to have more or less a centralized architecture. It's very difficult to create interoperability between things using these technologies. And obviously, using such technologies it doesn't require you, but it most often does create or cause centralized systems to be built. MQTT you might have heard of. It's I think the most popular protocol when it comes to IoT. When you ask engineers in IoT what protocol they use, MQTT has a huge market. And why is because simple and easy to start with, and it has a new novel way to distribute information. You have these publishers. Publishers can all reside in different local networks protected by separate firewalls. They all connect to a broker. They can all publish information on different topics ordered in a topic tree. You can have subscribers. There can be many more subscribers than publishers, obviously. And they also connect to the broker. They also reside in different local area networks with different firewalls. And they subscribe to different topics and receive the information being published there. It's great for distributing large amounts of information quickly. And it does that greatly. However, when it comes to privacy and security, it's more like a Swiss cheese without the cheese and only the holes. So remember, it is very efficient to transport and distribute information. But when it comes to privacy and also security, I only list here privacy-related issues. It has a lot to wish for. For instance, it doesn't forward identities. What does that mean? It means that you as a subscriber, you have no way of knowing from MQTT if the data comes from the one it's supposed to come or if it's injected. And authorization is something you have to implement. Obviously, that creates interoperability problems because anything proprietary becomes very difficult to use as a platform for interoperability. But injection is a great threat. So you can inject control signals, you can falsify data, you can make things crash by sending data they respond badly to. You can, in GSM systems, you can deplete entire bandwidth, and so on. There's also this privacy issue. When you publish data on a topic, you have no way of controlling who is allowed to subscribe to that topic. So you don't know who receives it. So it's a problem on both ends. So any type of access control has to be done out of band, as it's called, or out of the scope of MQTT. It's proprietary, very problematic to do interoperable solutions using proprietary solutions. You have the wildcard search. You can subscribe to an entire branch of the tree or the entire tree. It's great for anyone who wants to eavesdrop. So I can just say that I've done this in many occasions to get an overview of what's being communicated. Obviously, allowing somebody to get any information is not a good idea, as you mentioned. from a privacy perspective. So in order to get an MQTT system to work more or less securely, you need a very careful operation of the broker. Very careful. You need to control access control and network access rights and all these things in a proprietary fashion outside of the scope of MQTT as an operator. And obviously the operator is not interested to work just because it's fun. So it's most often dropped to reduce costs. And there are a lot of other issues with MQTT. Actually, it's the only protocol I know of that is explicitly mentioned in warnings from different governments. So MSB here in Sweden issued a warning against bad implementations of MQTT. So it is possible to use MQTT in a secure manner, but you really need to know all about the vulnerabilities. Otherwise you can do great damage. And this is also one of the reasons why James Clapper said Internet of Things is the greatest threat. It's one of the most used protocols. Most of implementations are bad, and you have all kinds of very, very sensitive systems connected to MQTT. Blockchain, most of you have heard of, obviously, is another technology with a lot of buzz, which is exceptionally poor choice if you want to protect privacy, if privacy is high on your list. So blocks, as you might be aware of, can only be added. So you cannot correct data, you cannot delete data. Data is there forever. And we already have certain articles in the GDPR broken. Now, some claim there are private blockchains, others say they're all public. Now, the GDPR states as follows. Risks should be estimated as if there are no data protection mechanism there to mitigate the risks. Why do they say that? Well, because they want to know if something happens, what is the risk to the subject? So we have to assume when we evaluate the risk according to the blockchain or GDPR that all blocks are always public. And since they cannot be deleted or changed in any way, you have huge privacy problems. Now, as we discussed earlier, hashes, there are some efforts to make blockchain secure using hashes. As we described, hashes is not anonymized data. And what's worse, the cryptographic algorithms in the blocks cannot be changed. There is no separation between algorithm and data representation. What does that mean? So let's take an example. You have a sensitive document, personal document. You think the blockchain is private, so a hash is stored in one of the blocks about you having this document and everything it states. Somehow this blockchain becomes public, and newspapers start to write, or whoever writes, say, hey, I have access to this document, I can see there's a hash there, this is your document. So there is no way for you to delete the hash, first of all. Secondly, since the algorithm is fixed, there is a natural time limit for when this algorithm becomes weak. So in a couple of years, some agency might fraudulently create a document with your name on it, with fraudulent information in it, that provides the same hash. And they can use it to harm you. And there is no way for you to get this hash to disappear. Yes? So what I say is, blockchain is not suitable for personal information at all, unless it's information that should be public, like in a public notary. So any type of yes, you're correct. So I personally say it doesn't work. Yes. And every blockchain has a best before date. It might be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years, but there is a best before date. And this is why secure protocols, secure implementations, they separate cryptographic algorithm from data representation. So data represented cannot be mixed with cryptography, because cryptography has a best before date. It has to be able to adapt and change, like TLS, for instance. You can change ciphers. As soon as ciphers become obsolete, they change automatically. It doesn't change the underlying data representation. But blockchain is seriously flawed in this regard. So it can be used for insensitive information, but for personal information or sensitive information, best not use it. Simple as that. Now, there are technologies that actually have no impact on privacy. We might believe they do, but they don't. Now, you might recognize these technologies: TLS, DTLS, datagram TLS, X509 for certificates, VPN, private networks. All these things are related to security. Security is not privacy. You can have very secure systems that completely violate your privacy. The Chinese social credit system is one. The Facebook VPN is another. So you have all these technologies. These are great tools for security, but they don't apply to privacy. So don't listen to these arguments as arguments for privacy. Privacy and security are not the same thing. Of course, they are can be used to help protect privacy also, but they don't inherently do so. Now, there are technologies that can do both harm or good. So let's discuss those. And they mostly relate to identities, use of identities or not. Do we want to protect the anonymity of users, or do we want to have strong identities on users? And so they can both protect and do damage, depending on our use. But they have very strong privacy-related implications, so I want to discuss this. So let's take anonymity, for instance. So there are valid reasons for anonymity in a smart society, in a free society. We need the possibility for whistleblowers to provide sensitive information if somebody is doing something criminal. We need to have space for dissidents. Any society that prohibits dissidents becomes totalitarian. So we need anonymity, but we have to keep in mind that anonymity also helps the criminal or the terrorist, but these are side effects. Now, anonymity makes security decisions very, very difficult. So we as information owners, we don't know to whom we give it. So it doesn't protect our privacy, it protects the other's privacy. And also obviously leaking sensitive information can also be used by private people who leak sensitive information, for instance, revenge porn as is too often perpetrated, for instance. Strong identities, on the other hand, is used often. People get scared about how can strong identities protect our privacy. Well, it can be used to track us. That's true. It can. But it also helps us decide to whom should we give our personal data. So if we want to protect our privacy, we need to know with whom we communicate. This is one of the points in the definition of privacy, to be able to choose with whom we communicate. And in order to do that, we need the strong identity of the other party. Now, the danger here obviously is, how do we make sure this identity is not used to infringe our rights? Now, GDPR states that logging for security purposes is permitted, it's legitimate. So anyone who has managed information systems know that in order to combat intrusions or intrusion attempts, you need to log what happens so you can find anomalies. So that's legitimate. But how do you restrict logging to that purpose? And so one proposal and one solution that we will discuss more in these lectures is a way to do this, and that's to use server software that is only brokers. They don't do any actual processing themselves. They just relay messages. Messages can be end-to-end encrypted. So the actual sensitive information is only processed on the ends, and the brokers can log where messages are sent and from where maximum. But since we propose the use of standard middleware, not proprietary, they can also be open, so they can be checked and double-checked and replaced, which makes surveillance very difficult. So let's talk about solutions. We have had a lot of problems. There are some solutions. I've mentioned one, edge computing. By performing processing as much as you can on the edge in a decentralized manner, you can protect privacy as long as it's possible. There is also a protocol that actually have privacy-related features built into it. It was designed by the instant messaging community, which are cynical at best and paranoid at worst. So the protocol has very good security features built into it, which we'll discuss. And then also this effort that the Internet Stiftelse here is funding, which is this work on the IEEE IoT harmonization, which try to solve many of these privacy-related issues that we've discussed. So first, so if centralization is a problem, what does decentralization do? So okay, one thing is it adds the number of attack surfaces. So it might be you have more points that can be attacked, but each node is worth less, so it's easier to protect. So remember, it's not worth to break a node unless the value, what you get back, is worth more than the effort you put into it. So it's actually easier to protect the decentralized. Just like a distributed denial of service attack is more efficient if the attackers are distributed, a distributed system is more resilient to such an attack, for instance. Massive data breach is obviously very difficult, and you can use end-to-end encryption so that even the operators cannot get access to the data that you're processing. And another benefit, as long as you have a decentralized architecture, you can always do centralized processing on parts of the data. You're not prohibited. But once you've gone centralized, you can never go back and be decentralized. So it's a one-way street. So as long as you try to do as much decentralized as possible, you have more options available. XMPP, what it does is it allows, you can say simply that XMPP is a fast mail protocol. It's for instant messaging. It's not for large mail. You can send messages very quickly, global scalability. You can have a federated set of brokers. Anyone can set up their own broker, as shown here. Anyone can connect to them and communicate with anyone else in the federated network. It has some security features that mail doesn't have, which is why spam arose in mail, for instance. So it solves a great deal of problems. It allows devices to communicate even though they are behind different firewalls. You don't have to build massive data centers to have global scalability. And it has authorization, very good authorization features. Now, it also allows you to do anything you like when it comes to communication. So it's extensible in all ways. So comparing the different protocols here, you have different communication patterns like asynchronous messaging, request response, publish, subscribe, federation, a broker that helps devices, and peer-to-peer. And as you see, XMPP can support all. So you're not limited in any way. It even has multiple options for publish-subscribe, for instance. So it doesn't leave you wanting as a developer. It also has great data protection features by design, so obviously decentralized. It has this ubiquitous encryption, which means that all transports are encrypted. It supports end-to-end encryption. It has these global identities. Each client to a broker has an identity, like a mail address. If you want, it looks like a mail address, and this address is always forwarded, so you can always know from whom you received a message or a request. You can make good security decisions based on that. And also, it has an authorization principle, which is built into the protocol and which is managed by the endpoints themselves. So there is no load on the operator. The participants can negotiate this freely. And this comes. This is what's called data protection by default in the General Data Protection Regulation. You need a successful what's called presence negotiation between two parties before you can actually communicate efficiently between them. This is what's lacking in mail, and this is why you have these huge problems with spam. In XMPP, you need this negotiation, and this is exactly what GDPR calls consent. You actually have a consent-based protocol in XMPP that manages this problem for you. And it's as easy to withdraw this consent, obviously, as it is to give. We'll talk more about the IEEE IoT harmonization in a separate lecture dedicated only to this. But just to mention, it has all these features that help you build a smart society, all from managing sensor data and actuators and control operations, all the way down to data protection and economic feedback model and all these things. So I hope you come to this lecture if you're interested in these topics. So this is being worked on as we speak. So there are interfaces already published, and a first draft of this will be done in just a couple of months or some months. So I'll start to round off. I mean, before you all die of boredom. So just to mention, it's a series of lectures. If you have time, you're more than welcome to come and join. We have had now 2 lectures. We also have a series of laboratory labs where we can start to try and play with these concepts. The next lecture will be an open and/or secure smart city. So can you have an open interoperable network that is secure? And the answer for you, spoiler alert, is yes. So we'll discuss how to do that. We also have a set of labs. We've had now 2 labs, and where we start to build sensors and actuators, connect them, chat with them, publish data, and interact with them, and finally incorporate the last steps of the IoT harmonization when the draft is published. And I also have written a lot about these topics in this book. It includes a lot of what we have discussed. And so if we get the microphone working, perhaps you have had a lot of questions. Anyone knows how this works? You know? Hmm? Okay. Also, for anyone lacking caffeine or sugar, please. now. So we had some very good questions before, but if you want to expand, anyone has a question or worry, or if you dissent, please feel free. The camera is not pointing at you, so you can criticize anything here.
I think you had in a topic somewhere about encryption in your sessions, upcoming sessions.
Yes.
So today in the encryption from edge to edge, is it like symmetric or asymmetric, or what is recommended?
So to get full security, you need hybrid ciphers that use both. So the question, obviously, do you use asymmetric or symmetric ciphers, which is best, and you need to use both to create secure end-to-end encryption ciphers. Is the answer. But we'll discuss this in this introduction to encryption. We'll discuss most major algorithms and how they work and for what purpose we use them, etc.
Yeah, I have one question. That is the protocol HTTPS,
yes,
the secure one.
Yes,
has privacy issues, doesn't it?
Yes, a lot.
You can track more easily the person who is visiting a website,
yes,
if it's encrypted.
Yes. Well, yes and no.
Because I've had discussions with MSB about this.
Yes. So the question is, if we use HTTPS, which is based on the TLS, is it easier to track usage? And obviously, if you use what's called mutual TLS, where you use client certificates, you have a very strong identity on the other end, which you can track, obviously. As I mentioned here, security is not privacy. So it's a fallacy to believe that just because communication is encrypted, that you're somehow protected from a privacy point of view. Often it's as you say, the reverse. This VPN, for instance, the most recent from our friends in the social network industry, their VPN actually monitors you. So it monitors you more than what their service does. So the VPN is actually a worse choice. Yeah. So HTTP is not defined to solve a problem that we are trying to solve in smart cities. But since it is the most known protocol, anyone doing a prototype uses what they know. And there is nothing as permanent as a temporary solution. So that's the problem. Anyone with more dissent? Or question? Somebody agrees? Yeah.
Well, you talked about the next generation of GDPR, for instance, and I think consent is one of the weak spots of the whole thing, because let's take biometric, let's take a detailed portrait, for instance, biometric data. You're allowed to store that with consent. But do people have enough knowledge to know what the hell they are saying, giving consent to, first thing. Second thing, I give consent to a lot of things out there. I don't remember what I've given consent to. I have the right to withdraw it, but I don't know what I have out there. So there are lots of things I think needs to be updated in the regulation.
And I think many of these concerns can actually be claimed are the fault of the companies. So they should make it easier for you to find. When it comes to biometric data, companies are not allowed to process that information. So biometric data is considered special categories of data in GDPR. And there is a general prohibition of processing such information. The only
unless you have consent. It's clearly in the reg.
Yes, but also you need guidelines. So there need to be guidelines, what kind of biometric data, how it can be processed and so on. So obviously you have authentication into applications as one use case where it could be claimed it's legitimate. But as you say, people don't understand. But then we fall back on the transparency principle. You as a controller is obliged to provide transparent information. If you don't understand, it's the fault of the controller, not the person who doesn't understand. If we have data protection authorities that is sufficiently astute to process this in court is another matter. Personally, I don't have a lot of hope for Swedish authorities because they like to, as we mentioned here, not make so much fuss. But we have in our vicinity, we have Germany, as mentioned, we have France, we have Great Britain, we have Spain, Austria. They are more hungry when it comes to processing these things in court. Also, we have activists. So we have very famous privacy advocates that actually do these kinds of processes. They understand the subject matter. They are doctors in law. They know how to make their case heard. So personally, I feel optimistic that these things can be solved already without modifying the GDPR. But we'll see. More bulle? No? More coffee? Yeah? We're all in agreement? Privacy is a good thing? Okay, then thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
There's an article I shared on my profile that talks about these issues you just mentioned.